Today we explore 10 scientific paradoxes that don't just challenge conventional wisdom, they obliterate it entirely. Each paradox represents a direct assault on human reason, forcing us to confront the possibility that the universe itself might be fundamentally irrational. Prepare to have your understanding of reality systematically dismantled as we journey through contradictions that have tormented the greatest scientific minds for centuries. The grandfather paradox represents the ultimate collision between possibility and impossibility. Imagine traveling back in time and preventing your own grandfather from meeting your grandmother. If your grandparents never meet, your parents are never born. If your parents don't exist, neither do you. But if you don't exist, who traveled back in time to prevent the meeting in the first place? This paradox destroys the concept of consistent causality. Every proposed solution creates new contradictions that spiral into infinite loops of logical impossibility. The many worlds interpretation suggests that changing the past creates alternate timelines, but this merely pushes the paradox into parallel dimensions where it continues to multiply endlessly. Some theorists propose that time travel creates self-correcting loops where events conspire to prevent paradoxes. But this implies that the universe possesses some form of temporal immune system that protects causality from logical contradiction. Such a system would require reality itself to be conscious and actively monitoring billions of potential paradoxes simultaneously. The most disturbing aspect isn't the paradox itself, but what it reveals about the nature of time. If the past can be changed, then history becomes fluid and reality loses all stability. If the past cannot be changed, then free will becomes an illusion, and every action throughout history was predetermined from the moment the universe began. Modern quantum mechanics offers no escape from this dilemma. Quantum effects that allow for temporal loops also permit multiple contradictory states to exist simultaneously. The grandfather paradox reveals that time itself might be fundamentally paradoxical, existing in states that violate basic logical principles, while somehow maintaining the appearance of consistency. The bootstrap paradox attacks the very concept of information and causation. Consider a scenario where a time traveller brings Shakespeare's complete works back to the 16th century and gives them to a young William Shakespeare, who then publishes them as his own. Who actually wrote Hamlet? Shakespeare received the plays from the time traveller, but the time traveller got them from Shakespeare's published works. This creates a causal loop where information exists without origin. The plays have no creator, emerging from nothing and sustaining themselves through circular time travel. Every attempt to trace the source leads back to the same impossible loop where effect precedes cause and creation occurs without a creator. The paradox extends beyond literature into the realm of scientific knowledge. If a time traveller brings advanced mathematical theorems to ancient Greece, who discovered those theorems? The ancient mathematicians learned them from the time traveller, but the time traveller learned them from historical records of ancient mathematical achievements. The knowledge exists in an endless loop with no point of origin. This challenges our fundamental understanding of how information comes into existence. All human knowledge appears to require discovery, invention, or creation by conscious minds. But the bootstrap paradox reveals scenarios where complex information exists without any creative process, violating the basic principle that effects must have causes. The implications are staggering. If information can exist without origin, then the entire history of human intellectual achievement might be built on knowledge that has no source. Every scientific discovery, artistic masterpiece, and philosophical insight could potentially exist in a bootstrap loop, where the future informs the past, which creates the future in an endless cycle of impossible causation. Zeno's paradox of motion demonstrates that simple movement should be impossible according to mathematical logic. To travel from point A to point B, you must first travel half the distance. To travel that half, you must first travel half of that distance. This process continues infinitely, creating an endless series of smaller and smaller distances that must be traversed before any movement can occur. Since an infinite number of tasks cannot be completed in finite time, Zeno concluded that all motion is an illusion. We observe movement, but logic proves it cannot exist. This paradox has tormented mathematicians for over 2 millennia, revealing a fundamental conflict between mathematical reasoning and empirical observation. Modern mathematics attempts to resolve this paradox through calculus and infinite series convergence. The infinite number of half-distances supposedly adds up to the finite total distance, but this solution merely describes the paradox mathematically without explaining how an infinite sequence of tasks can be completed in reality. The paradox becomes even more disturbing when applied to time itself. Each moment can be divided into smaller moments, creating an infinite regression where the present moment never arrives. If time consists of an infinite number of infinitesimal instants, how does any instant ever pass? How does the future ever become the present if an infinite number of subdivisions must occur first? Quantum mechanics suggests that space and time might be fundamentally granular rather than continuous, potentially resolving Zeno's paradox through discrete minimum units. But this solution creates new paradoxes about the nature of reality at the quantum scale, where particles exist in multiple states simultaneously, and observation changes the fundamental nature of what is being observed. The ship of Theseus paradox destroys our understanding of identity and continuity. If every plank of an ancient ship is gradually replaced with new wood, is the resulting vessel still the same ship? What if the old planks are collected and reassembled into their original configuration? Which ship is the true ship of Theseus? This paradox reveals that identity is far more fluid and arbitrary than we assume. Every cell in your body is replaced over time, yet you consider yourself the same person throughout your life. But if physical continuity doesn't determine identity, what does? Your memories change, your personality evolves, and your thoughts constantly shift. What remains constant that could be called the essential you? The paradox becomes more complex when applied to consciousness itself. If your brain were gradually replaced with functionally identical artificial components, at what point would you cease to be human? Would the resulting entity possess your consciousness or merely simulate it? If consciousness can be transferred between physical substrates, then identity becomes completely disconnected from material existence. Modern neuroscience offers no clear resolution. Consciousness appears to emerge from the complex interactions of billions of neurons, but the exact mechanism remains mysterious. If consciousness is purely physical, then replacing brain components should preserve identity. If consciousness is non-physical, then identity becomes independent of material existence entirely. The paradox extends into digital realms, where information can be perfectly copied. If your consciousness could be uploaded to a computer and perfectly duplicated, which copy would be you? Both would possess identical memories and thought patterns, yet they would be separate entities. Identity fractures into multiple simultaneous versions that all have equal claim to being the original. The paradox of the heap attacks the very concept of classification and meaning. If you remove one grain of sand from a heap, it remains a heap. Continue removing individual grains, and at each step, you still have a heap. But eventually, you reach a point where only one grain remains, which clearly isn't a heap. Yet no single removal transformed a heap into a non-heap. This reveals that most of our concepts lack precise boundaries. When does a child become an adult? At what point does a bald man lose enough hair to be considered bald? How many members can leave a group before it ceases to exist? These questions have no clear answers because our language and concepts are fundamentally imprecise. The paradox becomes particularly troubling in scientific contexts where precise definitions are supposedly crucial. When does a planet become large enough to be considered a star? How many atoms must be removed from a molecule before it becomes a different substance? At what threshold does a collection of matter gain consciousness? Attempts to resolve the paradox through arbitrary boundary setting merely highlight its fundamental nature. Drawing precise lines between categories requires decisions that are essentially random, revealing that our entire system of classification rests on arbitrary foundations. The universe itself doesn't recognize the boundaries we impose on it. The Fermi paradox confronts us with the crushing loneliness of existence. Given the vast number of stars in the observable universe and the billions of years available for life to develop, intelligent civilizations should be common. Yet we observe no evidence of alien intelligence despite decades of searching. Where is everybody? The numbers are staggering. Our galaxy contains hundreds of billions of stars, many with planetary systems that could support life. Even conservative estimates suggest that millions of intelligent civilizations should exist within our galaxy alone. Some of these civilizations should be millions of years more advanced than humanity, possessing technology that would make them detectable across interstellar distances. Various solutions have been proposed, each more disturbing than the last. Perhaps intelligent life inevitably destroys itself through war, environmental collapse, or technological catastrophe. Maybe advanced civilizations deliberately hide from younger species. Or perhaps we are truly alone, the only conscious observers in a universe that stretches beyond imagination. The most terrifying possibility is that intelligence itself is a cosmic accident so improbable that it occurs only once per observable universe. This would mean that human consciousness represents the universe becoming aware of itself, a responsibility so profound that it transforms every human action into a cosmic significance that most people cannot comprehend. Recent developments in artificial intelligence and space exploration have added new dimensions to the paradox. If intelligence can be artificially created, then conscious entities should be able to spread throughout the galaxy at unprecedented rates. The continued silence from the cosmos becomes each passing year increasingly ominous of technological advancement. The paradox of omnipotence shatters our understanding of absolute power and logical possibility. Can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy that even they cannot lift it? If they can create such a stone, then they are not omnipotent because they cannot lift it. If they cannot create such a stone, then they are not omnipotent because there is something they cannot do. This paradox reveals that the concept of unlimited power contains internal contradictions that make it logically impossible. Every attempt to define omnipotence leads to scenarios where absolute power negates itself. The paradox suggests that even infinite capability must operate within the constraints of logical consistency. Religious philosophers have struggled with this paradox for centuries, proposing that omnipotence means the ability to do anything that is logically possible. But this limitation contradicts the very definition of unlimited power. If logic constrains omnipotence, then logic becomes more fundamental than divine power, creating a hierarchy where mathematical principles supersede supernatural abilities. The paradox extends beyond theological discussions into the realm of computational theory and artificial intelligence. Could a super-intelligent computer system become so powerful that it could create problems it cannot solve? The question reveals fundamental limits to information processing that may apply even to hypothetically infinite computational resources. Modern physics compounds the paradox through quantum mechanics and relativity. The universe itself appears to operate according to fundamental laws that cannot be violated, even by hypothetically omnipotent entities. This suggests that reality possesses an underlying logical structure that transcends any conceivable form of power or intelligence. The paradox of tolerance destroys the foundations of liberal democratic society. A tolerant society must tolerate all viewpoints and behaviors to remain truly tolerant. But what happens when some members advocate for intolerance itself? Should a tolerant society tolerate those who seek to eliminate tolerance entirely? If society tolerates intolerant ideologies, those ideologies may eventually gain enough power to destroy tolerance itself. But if society refuses to tolerate intolerant viewpoints, then it abandons its commitment to universal tolerance and becomes intolerant by definition. Either choice leads to the destruction of tolerance as a guiding principle. This paradox has profound implications for modern political systems that claim to support free speech and open debate. Democratic societies must somehow balance protection of diverse viewpoints with prevention of ideologies that seek to eliminate democratic values. The resulting tension creates perpetual conflicts about censorship, hate speech, and the limits of acceptable discourse. The paradox becomes particularly acute in digital environments where information spreads instantly across global networks. Platforms that promise open communication must decide whether to tolerate content that advocates for the elimination of open communication itself. Every moderation decision either compromises neutrality or enables the spread of anti-democratic ideologies. Historical examples demonstrate the real-world consequences of this paradox. Societies that maintained absolute tolerance often found themselves overwhelmed by movements that exploited democratic freedoms to establish authoritarian control. The paradox reveals that tolerance, like omnipotence, contains internal contradictions that make its pure implementation impossible. The liar paradox attacks the very foundations of truth and language. Consider the statement, "This sentence is false." If the statement is true, then it must be false as it claims. But if it is false, then its claim about being false must be incorrect, making it true. The statement creates an endless loop where truth and falsehood interchange infinitely. This paradox reveals fundamental problems with self-reference in logical systems. Any language powerful enough to refer to itself generates statements that cannot be assigned consistent truth values. The paradox suggests that human language contains inherent contradictions that make complete logical consistency impossible. Mathematicians have discovered that similar paradoxes infect formal logical systems, leading to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which prove that any sufficiently complex mathematical system must be either incomplete or inconsistent. The liar paradox demonstrates that these limitations extend beyond mathematics into everyday language and reasoning. Computer scientists encounter the paradox in programming contexts where systems must process self-referential commands. Artificial intelligence systems that attempt to model their own reasoning processes face similar logical contradictions that can cause infinite loops or system failures. The paradox suggests fundamental limits to computational self-awareness. The implications extend into philosophy of mind and consciousness studies. If human thought processes involve self-reference, then consciousness itself might contain paradoxical elements that prevent complete self-understanding. The mind attempting to understand itself may encounter the same logical contradictions that plague the liar paradox. The paradox of the unexpected hanging challenges our understanding of knowledge, certainty, and logical deduction. A judge tells a condemned prisoner that he will be hanged on one of the next 5 weekdays, but the execution will be unexpected. The prisoner reasons that he cannot be hanged on Friday because if he survives until Thursday evening, he would expect Friday's execution. By similar logic, Thursday becomes impossible because after Wednesday, only Thursday and the impossible Friday remain, making Thursday expected. Continuing this reasoning, the prisoner eliminates Wednesday, Tuesday, and finally Monday, concluding that no unexpected execution is possible. Satisfied with his logical proof, he is completely surprised when guards arrive on Wednesday morning to carry out the sentence. The execution is unexpected, precisely because his reasoning convinced him it was impossible. This paradox demonstrates that logical reasoning can create blind spots in human understanding. The prisoner's deductive logic was flawless, yet it led him to a conclusion that enabled the very outcome he proved impossible. The paradox reveals that certainty about future events can become self-defeating when that certainty influences the reasoning process itself. The paradox has applications in game theory, military strategy, and economic prediction. Any system that uses logical analysis to predict future events may create vulnerabilities that opponents can exploit. Perfect logical reasoning can become a weakness when adversaries understand and anticipate that reasoning process. Modern artificial intelligence systems face similar challenges when attempting to predict human behavior or optimize complex systems. The act of prediction can change the system being predicted, creating recursive loops where analysis invalidates itself through its own conclusions. The paradox of Achilles and the tortoise presents another devastating challenge to human reasoning about infinite processes. In this version of Zeno's paradoxes, the swift warrior Achilles races against a slow tortoise that is given a head start. Logic dictates that Achilles can never overtake the tortoise because by the time he reaches the tortoise's starting position, the tortoise will have moved slightly ahead. When Achilles covers that new distance, the tortoise advances again. This process continues infinitely, suggesting that fast runners can never overtake slower ones despite obvious empirical evidence to the contrary. The paradox reveals deep problems with how human minds process infinity and continuous motion. Mathematical solutions involving limits and convergent series describe the outcome but fail to resolve the underlying logical contradiction. We can calculate when Achilles will pass the tortoise, but the reasoning that proves he cannot remains logically valid. This paradox becomes particularly troubling when applied to modern physics and cosmology. If space and time are infinitely divisible, then every physical process involves completing infinite sequences of events. The universe operates through mechanisms that logic suggests should be impossible, indicating fundamental flaws in human reasoning about reality. Quantum mechanics offers potential resolution through discrete space-time units, but this solution creates new paradoxes about the granular nature of reality. If space consists of indivisible units, what happens at the boundaries between units? The attempt to resolve one paradox generates new contradictions that multiply endlessly. The paradox of material constitution strikes at our basic understanding of objects and their properties. A statue and the clay from which it is made occupy identical space and share all physical properties, yet they seem to be different things. The clay existed before the statue was formed and will continue to exist if the statue is destroyed. The statue, however, cannot exist without that specific arrangement of clay. This paradox challenges the fundamental question of what makes something the thing it is. If the statue and clay are identical in all physical respects, what distinguishes them? If they are the same object, how can one exist without the other? If they are different objects, how can two distinct things occupy identical space simultaneously? The paradox becomes more complex when considering human identity and consciousness. Your body consists of atoms arranged in specific patterns, but those atoms are constantly being replaced through metabolic processes. The physical matter that constitutes your body today is almost entirely different from the matter that constituted it 7 years ago, yet you maintain continuous identity throughout this complete material replacement. Modern neuroscience reveals that even thoughts and memories undergo constant physical change at the cellular and molecular level. If consciousness emerges from material processes that are constantly changing, what maintains the continuity of personal identity across time? The paradox suggests that identity exists independently of the physical substrate that supports it. These paradoxes collectively reveal that reality operates according to principles that transcend human logical capacity. Each contradiction represents not a failure of scientific understanding, but a fundamental limitation of conscious reasoning when confronted with the true nature of existence. The universe appears to be structured in ways that violate the basic assumptions of human cognition, suggesting that ultimate truth may be forever beyond the reach of minds that evolved to navigate much simpler environments. The implications are staggering. If logical reasoning fails at such fundamental levels, how can we trust any conclusions about reality? How can science proceed when its basic methods encounter paradoxes that resist resolution? These questions reveal that the search for understanding may be an inherently paradoxical endeavor, where each answer generates new contradictions that spiral into infinite complexity. Human consciousness finds itself trapped in a universe where logic breaks down, causation becomes circular, and identity dissolves into arbitrary boundaries. We are reasoning beings living in an apparently unreasonable reality, forever seeking understanding through methods that may be fundamentally inadequate to the task. The paradoxes continue to multiply, each one revealing new depths of mystery that challenge everything we thought we knew about existence itself. Yet even as these paradoxes shatter our confidence in logical reasoning, they reveal something profound about the nature of reality itself. Perhaps the universe isn't designed to be comprehensible to human minds. Perhaps consciousness emerged in a cosmos that operates according to principles so alien to our evolutionary programming that complete understanding remains forever impossible. The paradox of the barber exposes the dangerous territory where self-reference meets logical classification. In a town, the barber shaves only those men who do not shave themselves. This seems straightforward until we ask the critical question: who shaves the barber? If he shaves himself, then he belongs to the group of men who shave themselves, which means he cannot shave himself according to the rule. But if he doesn't shave himself, then he belongs to the group that he is supposed to shave, meaning he must shave himself. This creates an impossible situation where the barber both must and cannot shave himself simultaneously. The paradox reveals fundamental problems with how we define categories and membership rules. Any system that allows self-reference in classification generates contradictions that cannot be resolved through logical analysis. Bertrand Russell formalized this paradox in mathematical terms, demonstrating that set theory itself contains similar contradictions. The set of all sets that do not contain themselves as members creates identical logical problems. If such a set contains itself, then it violates its defining property. If it doesn't contain itself, then it must contain itself according to its definition. These discoveries forced mathematicians to reconstruct the foundations of their discipline, imposing artificial restrictions on set formation to avoid paradoxes. But these restrictions feel arbitrary and incomplete, suggesting that mathematics itself rests on unstable logical ground. The barber paradox reveals that even our most rigorous systems of reasoning contain fundamental flaws that resist correction. Modern computer science encounters similar issues when designing systems that must reason about their own operations. Artificial intelligence programs that attempt to model their own decision-making processes face identical contradictions that can cause system failures or infinite loops. The paradox suggests that complete self-awareness may be logically impossible for any reasoning system. The paradox of analysis destroys our understanding of knowledge and explanation. If an analysis reveals something we already knew, then it teaches us nothing new and seems pointless. But if an analysis reveals something we didn't already know, then how could it be a correct analysis of our original concept? True analysis should preserve meaning rather than change it. Consider the statement that bachelors are unmarried men. This seems like a valid analysis of the concept of bachelorhood. But if we already understood what bachelor meant, then the analysis tells us nothing new. If we didn't already understand the connection to unmarried men, then the analysis changes our concept rather than clarifying it. This paradox reveals deep problems with how knowledge develops and spreads. Every explanation either assumes the listener already possesses the knowledge being explained, or fundamentally alters their understanding in ways that make the explanation incorrect. Education becomes impossible if true analysis cannot provide new information while remaining accurate. The paradox becomes particularly troubling in scientific contexts, where researchers attempt to analyze complex phenomena. If their analysis merely restates what was already known, then no progress occurs. If their analysis reveals genuinely new information, then they have changed the phenomenon rather than understood it. Scientific discovery appears to involve a contradiction where understanding requires altering the thing being understood. Philosophy faces the same dilemma when attempting to analyze abstract concepts like justice, beauty, or consciousness. Either the analysis captures something already implicit in our understanding, making it redundant, or it introduces new elements that transform the concept into something different. The search for clear definitions becomes self-defeating when clarity requires changing the thing being defined. The Simpson paradox demolishes our confidence in statistical reasoning and empirical evidence. This paradox occurs when trends that appear in separate groups reverse when those groups are combined. A treatment might be more effective for both men and women separately, yet less effective overall when both genders are analyzed together. Real examples of this paradox have profound implications for medical research, social science, and public policy. A university might show bias against women applicants overall, while simultaneously showing bias in favor of women in every individual department. A medication might help both young and elderly patients separately, while harming patients overall. These contradictions arise naturally from the mathematics of aggregation, not from errors in data collection or analysis. The paradox reveals that statistical truth is contextual and perspective dependent. The same data can support contradictory conclusions depending on how it is grouped and analyzed. This undermines the foundation of evidence-based reasoning, suggesting that empirical evidence cannot provide objective truth about complex phenomena. Modern big data analytics and machine learning systems encounter Simpson's paradox regularly when processing large data sets with multiple variables. Algorithms trained on historical data may perpetuate biases that reverse when demographic factors are considered separately. The paradox suggests fundamental limits to what can be learned from statistical analysis of complex real-world phenomena. The implications extend beyond technical statistics into everyday reasoning about cause and effect. If aggregating information can reverse apparent trends, then our intuitive understanding of how the world works may be systematically misleading. The paradox forces us to question whether complex social and natural phenomena can ever be understood through data analysis. The paradox of choice attacks our assumptions about freedom, preference, and rational decision-making. Having more options should make us better off by increasing the likelihood of finding something that matches our preferences perfectly. Yet psychological research consistently demonstrates that excessive choice leads to anxiety, paralysis, and decreased satisfaction with whatever option is finally selected. When faced with dozens of breakfast cereals, hundreds of investment options, or thousands of potential romantic partners on dating applications, people become overwhelmed rather than empowered. The cognitive burden of evaluating numerous alternatives exceeds human processing capacity, leading to decision avoidance or random selection that defeats the purpose of having choices in the first place. The paradox reveals fundamental limitations in human decision-making architecture. Our brains evolved to handle simple choices between a few alternatives, not complex optimization problems involving multiple variables and uncertain outcomes. Modern life presents decision environments that systematically exceed our cognitive capabilities, creating stress and dissatisfaction despite unprecedented freedom. Economic theory assumes that more choices always improve welfare by expanding opportunity sets. But the paradox of choice demonstrates that psychological costs can outweigh the benefits of additional options. Markets that maximize choice may minimize happiness, creating a contradiction between theoretical efficiency and actual human well-being. The digital age has amplified this paradox exponentially. Online shopping presents millions of product options that can be filtered and compared along dozens of dimensions. Social media exposes us to countless potential relationships and lifestyle choices that previous generations never encountered. The result is often paralysis rather than empowerment, as infinite possibilities create infinite anxiety about making suboptimal decisions. The paradox of tolerance in knowledge confronts us with the impossibility of maintaining intellectual openness while preserving truth. A genuinely open-minded approach to knowledge requires considering all viewpoints equally and remaining permanently uncertain about contested questions. But this commitment to intellectual humility makes it impossible to reject false or harmful ideas that masquerade as legitimate alternatives to established knowledge. Should educational institutions teach flat Earth theories alongside spherical Earth models in the name of intellectual openness? Should medical schools present faith healing as equally valid to scientific medicine? The demand for balance and open-mindedness can lead to false equivalencies that undermine the entire educational enterprise. Yet, rejecting obviously false viewpoints requires criteria for distinguishing truth from falsehood that themselves become contentious. Who decides which ideas deserve serious consideration and which can be dismissed? What prevents legitimate minority viewpoints from being suppressed alongside genuinely harmful misinformation? The paradox becomes acute in democratic societies that value both free inquiry and informed citizenship. Citizens need access to accurate information to make good political decisions, but censoring false information threatens the open debate that democracy requires. The tension between truth and freedom creates permanent instability in information environments. Modern digital platforms face this paradox when designing content moderation policies. Algorithms that suppress misinformation inevitably suppress some legitimate viewpoints, while algorithms that permit open debate inevitably amplify false and harmful content. The search for balanced solutions reveals that balance itself may be impossible when truth and openness conflict. The paradox of fiction challenges our understanding of emotion, meaning, and psychological engagement with imaginary scenarios. People experience genuine emotions when reading novels, watching movies, or engaging with other fictional narratives. They feel fear for characters who are in danger, sadness when protagonists suffer, and joy when stories reach happy conclusions. But these emotional responses seem irrational if people truly understand that the events and characters are imaginary. Why should anyone care about the fate of beings who don't exist? How can fictional scenarios generate real psychological effects when consumers know they are consuming fabricated content? The paradox becomes more complex when considering the relationship between fiction and learning. Stories seem to teach us about human nature, moral principles, and social dynamics through examples that never actually occurred. If fictional events have no reality, how can they provide genuine insight into real-world phenomena? Educational systems rely heavily on fictional scenarios to illustrate abstract concepts and moral principles. Students learn about courage from mythical heroes, about justice from imaginary court cases, and about scientific principles through thought experiments that could never be performed. The effectiveness of fictional examples suggests they possess a form of truth that transcends their literal falseness. The paradox extends into religious and philosophical contexts, where metaphorical stories convey spiritual or ethical insights. Parables, allegories, and symbolic narratives communicate profound truths through fictional frameworks that everyone understands to be fabricated. The relationship between literal truth and meaningful truth becomes paradoxically inverted. The Sorites paradox of consciousness strikes at the heart of the mind-body problem and our understanding of what it means to be aware. If consciousness emerges from neural activity, then there must be some threshold number of neurons required for awareness to occur. But removing a single neuron from a conscious brain cannot eliminate consciousness entirely, just as removing one grain cannot transform a heap into a non-heap. This reasoning suggests that consciousness should persist even as the brain is gradually destroyed, one neuron at a time. Yet clearly there must be some point where awareness disappears entirely. The paradox reveals that consciousness cannot be smoothly reduced to neural complexity without generating logical contradictions. The problem becomes more acute when considering artificial intelligence and machine consciousness. If awareness emerges from information processing complexity, then there should be some threshold where computer systems become conscious. But the Sorites reasoning suggests that no clear boundary can exist between conscious and unconscious information processing systems. Medical contexts present real-world versions of this paradox when determining consciousness in patients with brain injuries or degenerative diseases. At what point does cognitive decline eliminate consciousness entirely? How many mental faculties can be lost while preserving awareness? These questions have profound implications for end-of-life care and definitions of personhood. The paradox also applies to evolutionary development of consciousness. If awareness evolved gradually through natural selection, then there should be intermediate stages between unconscious and fully conscious organisms. But the Sorites reasoning suggests that no clear boundaries can exist in this evolutionary progression, making consciousness both universal and impossible. These paradoxes collectively reveal that human reasoning encounters fundamental limits when confronting the deepest questions about reality, knowledge, and existence. Each contradiction exposes assumptions so basic that we rarely examine them, yet so flawed that they generate endless loops of logical impossibility. The pattern is consistent across domains. Whenever we attempt to apply rigorous logical analysis to fundamental concepts, we discover contradictions that resist resolution. Language refers to itself and creates lies that cannot be true or false. Classification systems generate categories that cannot consistently include or exclude themselves. Mathematical reasoning proves that mathematical systems cannot be both complete and consistent. These 10 paradoxes prove that the universe operates according to principles that mock human logic and shatter our most basic assumptions about reality. We are reasoning creatures trapped in an unreasonable cosmos, forever seeking understanding through methods that may be fundamentally inadequate to the task. Each contradiction reveals that consciousness itself might be the ultimate paradox, an impossibility that somehow achieved existence in a reality where impossibilities define the very fabric of being. The greatest mystery isn't why these paradoxes exist, but why we continue to believe that reality should make sense at all.